We had two different streams happening here at the church, and that is our WISE committee, which stands for Welcome, Inclusive, Supportive, and Engaging for Mental Health, had been talking about how important it was to talk about the racial and economic disparities with how COVID-19 is affecting our communities. And so we were already inviting speakers to talk about those racial disparities. And then, of course, our focus as a nation has so importantly become about racial justice and making sure that we declare openly and boldly that Black Lives Matter and make attention to racial issues. At the same time, our sustainability committee was inviting speakers to help us think about what it means to be a creation justice church. You'll see more about that as we come to our annual meeting at the end of June, but we're voting on a covenant to become a creation justice church. And one of the members of our sustainability committee, John Wolfersberger, and he's on the call with us today. Thank you, John. Thought it would be a great idea to invite Sam Daley-Harris with us today. And Sam made it clear that his talk was not exclusively about climate justice, but about what has to happen first, which is we all have to be activated as citizen activists, which means not only being activists for issues such as climate change, but also racial justice. And so I know that what Sam will speak about today will be very important for so many issues. So we are so honored to welcome Sam. He is the founder of the anti-poverty lobby Results. He is also was a coach for the Citizens Climate Lobby for its first 7 years, and was the founder of Civic Courage, which helps nonprofits transform their members into courageous citizen leaders. He's also the author of the book Reclaiming Our Democracy: Healing the Break Between People and Government, which President Jimmy Carter said was a roadmap for global involvement and planning for a better future. I can't think of a better way to promote a book than that. So Sam, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy with a large population of people who believe nothing's going to get any better. In fact, these days, cynicism is obedience. What's really radical is being willing to look right at the magnitude and difficulty of the problems we face and still insist that we can solve those problems. That's Alex Steffen, a climate activist, futurist. And if you don't mind, optimism is a political act. Those who benefit from the status quo are perfectly happy with a large population of people who think nothing's going to get any better. In fact, these days, cynicism is obedience. I love that line. What's really radical is being willing to look right at the magnitude and difficulty of the problems we face and still insist that we can solve those problems. It's a great honor to be with you. Thank you to Pastors Jen and Jacob, and to John Wolfersberger, and to the entire church for having me. You could say that some aspect of my talk is, and what happens after the protests? Do we go home and stay engaged? Do we even know how to stay engaged? So let me go after that. Advocacy is on a spectrum. And I'm going to talk about one point on that spectrum. It's a relational, appreciative, bipartisan advocacy. It's not resistance. It's not better than. It's not worse than. It's just a different point on the advocacy spectrum. The title of my talk, I did it 25 times last year, tending to be online these days, this year, is "Our Shouting and Silence Are Only Two Options." And I always joke that I'm thinking of renaming it "Our Shouting, Silence, and Signing Online Petitions Are Only Three Options," bringing bipartisanship and transformation to citizen activism. And I have three main messages, and I'm going to go at the first one early. The first message is you can make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. I intend to demonstrate that after I tell my story. You can make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. Now, I have to say, this talk is intended for beginners. I know I'm not talking to a group of beginners. I've given this like 8 times to 8 different citizen climate lobby regional conferences with as many as 300 in the room. And I would say to them, and I would say to you, I know you're not beginners, but I want you to see what I say. And so here's my second message. You probably haven't made that profound difference, I tell my beginners, because of your sense of powerlessness and resignation about politics, especially federal politics. And the third message, if you can find an organization that's committed to dissolving the powerlessness, you can make that profound difference. So I'm going to just start with my story, and then I'm going to go to demonstrating you can make a profound difference on big issues. I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in music, and I played percussion instruments in the Miami Philharmonic Orchestra in Florida for 12 years. I taught high school music for 8 years. And 40 years ago, I started the anti-poverty lobby Results. And a lot of times I'm asked, music, poverty lobby, what's the connection and what motivated that change? And when I look back in my life, there are a couple of experiences that had a profound impact on me and started me asking different questions. I graduated from high school in 1964, and I played timpani in the orchestra at graduation. And just before the ceremony, a flute player came back to the percussion section and told me that a high school fraternity brother of mine, a year younger, had died the day before in a tractor trailer accident in Georgia. It was her next door neighbor, so she knew about it before I did. I always say I was 17. When I was 17, mortality was an irrelevant concept. But during the mourning period and the funeral, and after the funeral, I went with my friend's younger brother to pick up his report card from the homeroom teacher. It began to dawn on me that maybe I had 17 more minutes or months or years, and the questions of purpose came up. Why am I here? What am I here to do? What's my purpose? 4 years later, 1968, college graduation, Robert Kennedy's assassinated right around those days. And it was another one of those, what is this life? What is this death? Why am I here? What am I here to do? No answers, but the questions were getting clearer. 9 years later, 1977, I'm a little slow, I'm invited to a presentation on ending world hunger put on by the Hunger Project. And I go to this thing thinking, well, hunger's inevitable. What do I know? I'm a musician. I mean, it's inevitable because there are no solutions. Because I'm thinking there are no solutions because if there were solutions, somebody would have done something by now. But I go to this thing and almost immediately it's obvious. There's no mystery to growing food or clean water or basic health, literacy. I'm not hopeless about the perceived lack of solutions. I'm hopeless about human nature. People will just never get around to doing the things that can be done. But there's one human nature I have control over, my own, and my questions. Why am I here? What am I here to do? So I get involved in a big way. This is the end of the story. In 1978 and 1979, I spoke to 7,000 high school students in Miami, where I lived, and Los Angeles, where I moved. And before going into the first classroom, I read statements from Jimmy Carter's Commission on World Hunger and others calling for the political will to end hunger. So I asked 7,000 high school students, what's the name of your member of Congress? I don't want to know if you wrote him. I don't want to know if you met him, just the name. Anyone want to unmute yourself if you've never heard this story before? Out of 7,000 students asked, anyone want to guess how many could tell me the name of their member of Congress? This would have been 41, 42 years ago. It's not much different since. Anyone want to guess?
1 in 10.
1 in 10, okay. Actually, 200 could answer correctly. 6,800 didn't know. So fewer than 3% could tell me the name of the member of Congress. And results started out of this gap between the calls for the political will to end hunger and the lack of basic information on who represented us in Washington on the other. So this is my, you can make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. Results volunteers started lobbying in 1984 on child survival, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, reported in the early 80s that 41,000 children around the world were dying every day from largely preventable, _preventable, malnutrition and disease, things like measles coupled with malnutrition, etc. And results volunteers lobbied every year, 84, 85, 96, every year, 2003, just for a few months on this and a few other key programs. And the latest report from UNICEF is that the 41,000 child deaths a day has fallen to 14,520. Now that's still scandalously high, but it is a profound difference on a big issue. And it will spike during COVID-19, sadly, but it is in that kind of trajectory. In a New York Times interview in 2013, former UNICEF Deputy Executive Director Kul Gautam said, to a great extent, it was because of the receptivity created by results that the US funding for child survival increased so dramatically, and that led many other countries to come on board. You can make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. I'm going to do one more, and I'm going to go a little deeper. And if you look at the bottom row only, I'm going to focus on the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. It was founded in 2002, and between 2002 and 2020, it and its partners have saved 32 million lives. It's a little bit more of the, you can make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. If you look at this bottom piece, the US provides 1/3 of the funding, and the other nations and the other donors provide the other 2/3. We were at the beginning last year of a 3-year replenishment, 2020, 21, and 22. And the Global Fund was looking for a 16% increase to save 16 million additional lives over those 3 years. But President Trump called for a 29% cut to the Global Fund, which sends a terrible message to the others. Maybe we should consider cutting ours too. Results volunteers led, grassroots-wise, in getting 157 Republicans and Democrats in the House to sign one letter to the top appropriators, and in getting 36 Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to sign another letter to top appropriators, and in getting 137 Republicans and Democrats in Congress to sign one letter to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, all in support of the Global Fund. Now, a year ago, February 2019, there was a preparatory meeting for the replenishment, and the US government didn't attend. It's another terrible signal to the others. But they took this letter to Mike Pompeo and they circulated it with 137 signers to all the delegates at that preparatory meeting. Actually, I'm going to stop my story there. I will tell you the end of it. But what I want to do is take a moment to get out of the percentages, the 1/3 of all funding, or the 1.35 billion, or the 25% cut proposed by the president, and get to the heart of this work. And I'm going to do that by reading an excerpt from a book by Stephen Lewis, who was Kofi Annan's special envoy for HIV/AIDS in Africa in the early 2000s. And his book is Race Against Time. And I'm going to read an excerpt just before what I've read tells about two little girls who can only go to school when they don't have to take care of their mother who's ill with AIDS. And then the second part, which I'm not going to tell, tells about grandparents taking care of their grandchildren because their own children and their spouses have died. And this part that I'm going to read from is about sibling-headed households where there are no grandparents, there are no other relatives, and the household is headed by one of the children. And so here we go. In this fourth story, Lewis tells about how he and Gracia Michelle, the wife of the late Nelson Mandela, are taken to a sibling-headed household in Uganda. Quote, "There were 5 children in all," Lewis recounted, 3 girls, 14, 12, and 10, and 2 boys, 11 and 8. We entered the modest hut with our backs to the wall. Gracia, with her arm around the 3 girls on her right, and I, with my arm around the 2 boys on my left. Gracia then told all the hangers-on to leave, all the media, all the UN staff, except for 1 community worker and 1 translator. I had no idea what was coming. Gracia turned to the 2 older girls and in a most gentle, reassuring voice asked, "Have you started to menstruate yet?" The 2 girls, clearly startled, replied in those shy, barely audible, whispered voices so characteristic of African children, "Yes." Then Gracia began to ask a series of questions. Do you know what it means? Have you talked with anyone about it? Do you talk to the villagers, your teachers, your fellow students? Does anyone bring you any pads? The atmosphere was intense. The little girls, now fully embraced in Gracia's arms, seemed to have suspended breathing, and I suddenly understood that I was witness to the first act of mothering that these girls had ever received about one of the most transfiguring experiences of a young girl's life. I've told this story a number of times because the experience had a profound impact on me. At the moment that Gracia asked her questions, I thought to myself, that's what's happening right across the continent. The transfer of love and knowledge and values and experience from one generation to the next is gone. And with it goes the confidence and security and sense of place, which children normally take for granted. Children already traumatized by the death of their parents are left reeling as they confront the void in the aftermath. As we were leaving, I asked the oldest sister, "Who puts you to bed at night?" "I put everyone to bed," she replied. "But bedtime can be pretty scary," I offered. "The nights are dark. The dreams can be upsetting. Don't any of the neighbors come in to help?" "No," she said matter-of-factly. "I put them to bed myself. I'm the mother." So I just want us to know that behind my numbers and dollars and billions and percents, there's these very, very human stories. And so the end of this particular story is that last October, 2019, 2 Republicans in Congress, 2 Democrats stood on a stage in France and announced that the US Congress was committed to the 16% increase to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria for 2020, 21, and 22. And in fact, US funding this year is $1.56 billion, which is that 16% increase. Now, President Trump has called for a 58% cut for next year, but these letters this year have had more signers than ever in the history of these sign-on letters. So, if our voices as citizens can make such a profound difference on big issues, why don't more of us get involved? That leads to our sense of powerlessness. This is a quote from Francis Moore Lappé, she wrote Diet for a Small Planet 49 years ago. And in a more recent book, she wrote, our real problem is not a heating planet or rampant malnutrition. We only have one real problem, our own feelings of powerlessness to manifest the solutions right in front of our noses. And again, our real problem is not a heating planet or rampant malnutrition. We only have one real problem, our own feelings of powerlessness to manifest the solutions right in front of our noses. And that's the gift of the groups I'm going to talk about briefly later that are committed to dissolving the powerlessness. So again, if our voices as citizens can make such a profound difference on big issues, why do more of us get involved? That leads to our resignation. And this is a quote from Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig, who focuses a lot on getting money out of politics. And he said a couple of years ago, we did a poll and found that 96% of Americans believe it important to reduce the influence of money in politics, but 91% don't think that's possible. That's the politics of resignation. But the politics of resignation gives you a perfect strategy for winning. How do we thaw that resignation? Because once we do, then I think we have a real chance for winning. And again, that's the gift of the groups that I work with. We work to create a structure of support so that when volunteers raise their hand, say, I'm in what? Is it in something that will empower them and thaw the resignation? So here's a common view of most groups doing advocacy work that are not up for thawing the resignation. I was talking to the head of a large group. You would know them very well. It's in the CARES Save the Children Oxfam category. And he said to me, we can't let our volunteers write letters to the editor or op-eds because they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. That's what he said to me. So much for thawing the resignation. They'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. So, so one of the groups I coached, its first 7 years, is Citizens Climate Lobby. Last year, their volunteers had 4,294 letters to the editor, op-eds, and editorials published. So one group saying they'll get it wrong and misrepresent the organization. The other group saying, what do we have to do to help them get it right, and give that to them, and then in a sense, set them free. Well, here's another common view of groups doing advocacy that are not up for thawing the resignation. So about 3 years ago, August, I was hired by a group. You would know their founder really well. And they wanted to start chapters all around the country. And there were 60 on staff, and I was going to coach 6 of them. And I got on the first call with the 6. Oh, sorry. I was hired 3 years ago, August, and I was fired 3 years ago, August. So I got on the phone with them and I said, you know, I know you're really hot to get on the road and start these chapters. I've sent a script that you could use when standing in front of the room to start the chapters. Let's edit it and then practice. And they said, well, we don't need to practice because we're not going on the road. If you want to start a chapter, you can go to our website, study the template for starting a new chapter and lead it yourself. We're not going on the road. Well, as I said, I lasted 3 weeks because I'm very into the staff launching things and practicing. And I had an exit interview with their CEO, and I said, you have an amazing mission, but you have a problem. Your team doesn't want to practice. And if you don't practice, you don't get much better. Even championship professional sports teams practice. And I was telling this story to an actress at lunch in New York City, and she said, even actors and actresses practice. And I said to the CEO, what's more, most people, including staff, are afraid of making big asks of volunteers. But if you practice, you can get over that fear. And so let me just touch for a moment on how it works. If let's say, let's see, what is this? Does this tell me how many are on this call now? Let's say there are 28 of us on this call right now. And I do this long presentation to launch a chapter. It's not actually like this, it's something else. And let's say 12 raise your hand, say I'm in. What you've just agreed to, and you knew because we went over it 3 times, is that we will circle up at the end of the meeting and pick a date, time, and well, in normal times, a location, we'll do it on Zoom now, for the first 2 of a 4-part new group training. So these 12 new chapter members get together physically or now on Zoom for a 4-part new group training, 90 minutes, 4 sessions. And when the sessions are over, then they jump on 2 meetings a month. One is a nationwide telephone conference call with guest speakers and Q&A, and there would be a grassroots victory, and there would be a little training on the call and the like. And then a second meeting of the month to be a better spokesperson on the issue. And again, it's this kind of thing that allows citizen climate lobby volunteers to go from 65 letters to the editor and op-eds published in 2010 to 4,294 in 2019, to go from 106 meetings with members of Congress or their staff in 2010 to 1,708 meetings last year. And so that gives you a little flavor for how it works. I want to tell you one quick story. One of the groups I'm coaching right now is Catholic Relief Services. It's been a blast. It's been amazing. And I was I've been coaching them for a year. And a woman wrote a story about how she went to her presidential caucus in Minnesota, and 2 people from her congressperson, she'd been at 2 meetings, the launch and the first training, that was it. 2 people from her congresswoman's office were speaking. And when they finished, they left. And she followed them out the door to ask if her Congresswoman Omar, would co-sponsor the Global Child Thrive Act, which would incorporate early childhood development into all US child-focused programs globally. Reading to children, singing to children, playing with colorful objects, all the things we would do with our own children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. And they gave her their card, and the next morning, she sent them more materials on the legislation. And about a week later, when she hadn't heard back, she called the district office, and the aide wasn't in. She asked the aide to call her. And sure enough, the aide called. It was the day of her second training of the 4 trainings. The aide called back, and they had the conversation. He talked to the aide in Washington. They thought this was something that the Congresswoman would co-sponsor. She hasn't yet. And she had her 2 little boys, 6 and 3, in the car, and she pleaded with them to be quiet while she had this call while driving on speakerphone. When the call was over, she tried to explain to her 6-year-old why she was so excited and how important it is to work with people in the government to make the world a better place. Now, I don't envision mothers describing to their 6-year-olds why signing an online petition left them so elated. But it was this like taking a chance and following that out the door when she really wasn't totally clear about the bill herself, 100%. She was just beginning to learn about it. And it just was a wonderful story. So again, my main messages are, you could make a profound difference on big issues with your voice as a citizen. Number 2, my newbies, I tell, you probably haven't, because your sense of powerlessness and resignation about politics, especially federal politics. And 3, if, big word, if you find an organization committed to dissolving the powerlessness, you can make that profound difference. And typically in my talks, when I'm physically in the room, I talk about results, who've worked on global and domestic poverty. There are global chapters, focused and domestic focused chapters. I talk about Citizens Climate Lobby, and their work is quite clear. I talk about the Quaker Lobby, FCNL. I coached them for 2 years, a few years ago. They're working often on peace issues. I talk about American Promise, whose focus is on money out of politics. And then I've added this newest group, Catholic Relief Services. Their work is on global poverty, particularly ECD, early childhood development legislation. If you go to the Civic Courage website, to the contact us part, it's there that you could let me know that you would like to be connected with one. I really plead with people, don't click 5, don't click 4, not 3, not 2, just 1, or none. None is fine. 0 is fine and 1 is fine. Any more than that, please do your own research and don't make more work for me. I'm going to skip along to this last section. One aspect of the Civic Courage process is a spiritual approach to politics, a politics of love. Well, I'm not going to read that excerpt. I'm going to read a different one. I was going to read you an amazing, amazing excerpt about a volunteer who started with Citizen Climate Lobby and said she was suffering from climate trauma. But she would read Bill McKibben's book Earth, and she would weep at home and weep at work. As she joined CCL 18 months later, she's co-leading a workshop where she describes this work as sacred and profound. But I'm not going to read that story. I'm going to read a different one. This is from a fellow, Steve Valk. His congressman in Atlanta in '85 was one of only 15 members of Congress who voted against famine aid for Ethiopia during the famine in 1985. And he said, like, if looking at Congress was like watching a sports team, we would be sitting in the stands with bags over our heads. We were so embarrassed to have Congressman Swindoll as our member of Congress. And I told him about a member of Results who 2 years earlier had written a prayer for his congressman for whom he had a similar experience. So they would read this prayer at their Results meeting at the beginning, and I'm going to read it to you. Thank you, God, for Pat Swindoll. We know he's a good man who wants to do right in the world. We know he struggles with the same problems we do, closing our hearts to those who don't agree with us. There are no thoughts or feelings he has had that we haven't had, and vice versa. We pray for all of us to learn compassion for people in our country and far away, for rich and poor. We pray that Pat and we will be less frightened of each other. We pray our focus will be more to love and appreciate him and less to change him. Help us remember that sharing love with the world is the highest contribution we can make and will lead to children being fed and the planet surviving. Forgive our righteousness and anger. Open our hearts and minds to find the next expression of love for Pat that he can receive. And they would read that at their meeting, and after they read it, they would go, yeah, right. And they'd read it the next time and they go, I don't think so. And then they'd read it the next time and they go, okay. And they'd read it the next time. Over the next 2 years, they meet with him with a smile and a handshake rather than the scowl, like most of his constituents. They're educating him. And 2 years later, after they start with the prayer, they go into a meeting with him on micro loans for the poor around the world. And he agrees to co-sponsor the bill and asks Steve, this guy who led with this prayer, if he would write an op-ed for a column he has in the newspaper once a week. And Steve said, I was now ghostwriting for a man who 2 years earlier had voted against famine aid for Ethiopia. We were probably the only lobby in Georgia who could get liberal Congressman John Lewis and conservative Congressman Pat Swindoll to co-sponsor the same bill. One more, in E&E News, Tom Moyer, a CCL volunteer who worked with former Representative Mia Love, Republican of Utah, former Congresswoman, said, "It's impossible to convince anyone of anything if you fundamentally don't like them. If you walk in thinking they're an idiot and evil, you're done from the start. It doesn't matter how logical your position is. You have to put yourself in a position where you can find something to respect in them. You might have a low opinion of your member of Congress, but you have to decide whether your goal is to be right about that or to cause a transformation. It's really up to you, but we'll never get climate change reversed, poverty eliminated, Citizens United overturned, nuclear war prevented with Democrats only or Republicans only. It has to be a bipartisan, transpartisan effort. Then I typically, again, pass out my clipboards where people are urged to check 0 or to check 1, no more than that. And again, if you go to civiccourage.org, contact us link, it gives you an opportunity to let me know, A, if you'd like to join the Civic Courage mailing list, but B, if you would like to be connected to 1, no more than 1, if you want to research all 5, go do that. But I would prefer not to introduce you to 5 different organizations. Basically, you're looking at an organization who could help you move out of your comfort zone, that's right here, over to where the magic happens. And most organizations encourage us to sign the petition, stay in our comfort zone, make a contribution, stay in our comfort zone, but not actually go over to where the magic is. I'm going to close with this quote. If you don't mind, I'm going to read it twice and we'll open it up to questions. This is the true joy in life. This is from George Bernard Shaw's Man and Superman. This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a selfish, feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I've got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. Once more, this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a selfish, feverish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of splendid torch which I've got hold of for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. And I want to thank the Claremont United Church of Christ for your passionate commitment to making that torch burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations. My apologies, this went a little long, but Jacob, I think we have time for a couple of questions before.
We do, yes. Sam, thank you so much for identifying that often powerlessness and resignation are barriers to us. I see people giving you the Zoom applause emojis. So thank you very much for kind of wrestling us out of that and thinking about ways that we can make substantive change. Are there questions that people have for Sam this morning?
Yes, I have a question. It's Laura Burt. Sam, I was wondering if you could share with us your personal moment of your breaking away from your comfort zone, transforming your viewpoint of who you are, and that sense of resignation. If you could share with us, I'd love to hear that.
Well, here's the thing. There wasn't one personal moment. There were many personal moments. And in my book, Reclaiming Our Democracy, I talk about one of them, which was, I'm trying to think, I was a substitute teacher that particular day at LeConte Junior High School in Hollywood, California. And I had been interviewed through my work with Jean Boutillier and some others at the Interfaith Hunger Coalition of Southern California by Kathy Hendricks of the LA Times. And I'd told her that a lot of editorial writers had said hunger was not a state or local issue. And she said, did you call the LA Times? I said, yeah, they didn't return my call. And she said, who'd you call? I said, I called Tony Day at the LA Times. She said, oh, don't call him. Call Kate. I'm forgetting her last name right now. She's the only woman on the editorial board at the LA Times. This would have been 1982 or something. And I called her from a payphone at a junior high school in California and on a break. And she said, well, it was the World Food Day candidate forum. And she said, we don't do editorials on days, Labor Day, World Food Day, whatever. Let's pick an issue and do one. And I sent her materials on a bill that Bread for the World was pitching. And I hung up the phone, and a few days later, or maybe a week later, an editorial appeared in the LA Times. And I noticed that not only had they written this editorial, they'd made 1 million copies of it, and they delivered it too. And I said in this little excerpt, I realized that I had the right training to make a difference. Music. I realized that I had the right job to make a difference. Substitute teacher. I realized that I had the right bank account to make a difference. Nearly zero. I realized that making a difference wasn't a function of any of those. It was a function of passion and commitment. And so that was just one of many, many experiences. We used to call it, in the early days of results, the nausea quotient. Whether we were up against something we thought we were not capable of, where we were moving out of our comfort zone. And if we could have some support in moving out of our comfort zone, to call the aide in DC, not the receptionist, but to talk to the aide and have an extended conversation, or whatever it was that was moving us out of our comfort zone. So Laura, it was many of those kinds of moments and it wasn't one of them that ended it for or extended it for anyone.
Sam,
hi Laura.
Sam,
Yes.
I wonder if you could say something about the phenomenal growth of the micro loan thing that you initiated.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. Very briefly, the Microcredit Summit was launched in 1995. Actually, the first summit was 97. I co-founded it with Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus of the Grameen Bank and FINCA founder John Hatch. We set a goal to reach 100 million of the world's poorest families, especially the women, with credit for self-employment and other financial services like savings. And we estimated that there were 8 million with a loan at the time of the first summit in 1997. And actually it took us till 2 years late. And we reached the goal of 100 million of the world's poorest families. The problem with that field is that it hit a fork in the road, and one fork was the piece that we were going down, was with the question, what more can we do for the benefit of the women, the clients? The other fork was, what more can we do for the benefit of investors? And we were on this fork, and we were not on that fork. But it is a field that had that kind of bifurcation in, let's call it, intention. And yeah. But the 100 million was reached in 2007, which was an extraordinary achievement.
And what is it now?
Well, you know, I left the Microcredit Summit in 2011, and I've been doing Civic Courage since then. And I don't know that it's being calculated on an annual basis at this point. The answer is I don't know actually right now. Jacob, is there one more question?
Any other questions? I see Mel, you have your mic off, or Donna, you just turned your mic off.
Go for it, Mel.
Okay. Well, Sam, it's a great presentation. I'm involved in a smaller group. It's called the United Nations Association. Our founding mother was Eleanor Roosevelt. We've had ups and downs in our lobbying, and we work on many of the same issues. We often are in Washington at the same time as the Citizens Climate Lobby. We've gotten to be pretty good friends. Sometimes we share hotel rooms because we often choose the same week to go to meet with Congress. And we're doing it virtually this year. Our action week is June 22nd to the 26th. So it was, I just take heart with a lot of what you said. Follow your passion. We're just one of many. My question to you is, there's a proliferation of organizations, I would say, around the current moment of Black Lives Matter. There's a group, 8 is Enough, many of the town halls that are being held. How can people who are in these separate groups work more effectively together to achieve change in the society writ large? I think a lot of us hunger and thirst for that.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things. Number one, it would be lovely if the groups at the national level initiated that, but we don't have to wait for that. In other words, groups locally of national organizations can do that work together, can kind of bring the disparate groups together. And so that's one very exciting thing, whereas headquarters may or may not initiate some kind of joint efforts. At the local level, we can always initiate that. The question that I keep asking is, which are the organizations, when the protest stops, that continue not only to empower and coach and train and encourage, but also grow the grassroots space and the activist space for the month in, month out work? And that's the question I think that's on the table. I think there's a lot of advocacy malpractice in the land, meaning kindergarten and treating citizens as kindergartners and first graders and maybe second graders, and not seeing them as capable, trainable, and up for bigger action, deeper action. That's the challenge, I think, that we need to face. And kind of going back, one other thing, you know, if there's any interest in having me talk to the UNA, I'd be happy to do that. Just you can write me and let me know, or find from John Wolfersberger my email and do that. Do we have time for Donna, or should we make time for church?
Yeah, Donna, do you have a question still?
Go to church.
Go to church. All right.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Okay, it's been a real honor talking with you.
Yeah.
And thank you for
Sam,
this
again.
invitation.
And everyone, we've kind of been called to find an organization that we can kind of support and be activated, to choose one and know that these organizations can make a difference. So thank you for guiding us in that. We'll be posting this video on our YouTube page, and we'll be continuing this conversation. It won't stop. We'll continue to have dialogue groups. So stay tuned. John, are you waving bye, or did you have something to say?
Yes. Thanks a lot, Sam.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
See you in worship.
Good to see you again, Sam. Blessings.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Gene.